All right. Today on the show, we are excited to talk to Ashley Hales. Ashley, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you today?
Doing really good. Ashley, you are releasing a brand new book called A Spacious Life. And I would love to hear a little bit about your story and what
Mhm.
led you to write the book.
Yeah, well, a lot of it happened maybe 10 or 15 years ago when I became a mother and I felt the limits of my body and the limits of my time. Um, Wendell Berry writes, we live the given life and not the planned. And I really wanted to live my planned life. And
Hmm.
so a lot of this book, I really wish I would have been able to read and take in kind of 15 years ago. And yet, as I'm approaching middle age as well, I'm realizing, we don't need necessarily more arguments about what the good life is, but we do need really good invitations. And so I'm hopeful that A Spacious Life is just a kind invitation. There's lots of folks who have read it already and said it just felt like a breath of fresh air. And that has felt like that's what I had desired, is that a spacious life, we will find it in Jesus as we actually live within our normal God-given limits instead of trying to push past them. So a lot of it came out, I think, from realizing this is my younger self, what I would have liked to have heard, and maybe myself now too. I need the reminder that our limits are good.
Yeah. And okay, so just so we know exactly what you're thinking, and so we're all on the same page. What do you
Mhm.
mean by limits?
Yeah, just good question. I don't mean the sorts of limits that, we have imposed globally to oppress and silence people. I don't mean, the limits that, that are the results of sin, particularly, although I know God can still work through them. But really, when I'm talking about limits in the context of a spacious life, I'm talking about our normal God-given limits, things like we are bodies in time, in places, amongst people, right? And that there are limits to how many friends we can have. There's limits to the good we can do in the world. There are limits to how much work we can do in the world, given that we need to sleep about 8 hours every night. That these are just some of these limits that unfortunately so much of our culture and even the church culture can really push past these limits, and we try to ignore them or control them. We try to stuff them away or we try to like hurdle over them. And really, I think that as we lean into our limits, as we bring them to God, we'll actually begin to have this sense of internal spaciousness growing in our lives.
Yeah. And so how does that happen? How are limits leaning into those limits? How are they
Mhm.
good for us?
Yeah. Well, it's so countercultural. I mean, everything right tells us that we need to be free, especially as
Mhm.
Americans. And so we tend to think of freedom now not as freedom for something, but freedom from something. And it's mainly we think of it as I need freedom to do whatever I want. And so it's not like freedom from tyranny across the ocean. Really, we think freedom looks like I can look inside myself, find out who I am, and everyone who says that that's wrong is against me, and therefore I need to like live my own truth. And really, at the very best, that sort of narrative, what that does is it actually puts us on this kind of moving walkway that we can never get off, where, you know, what makes me happy one day is not going to necessarily make me happy in 5 years. So if my marriage doesn't make me happy, then I can just get rid of it, or
Mm.
I can step on whoever I need to at work so that I can get that corner office. And those sorts of narratives are so ingrained into our psyches, that it's really hard to push past it. And yet the limits that are actually freeing for us, we can experience that. I mean, when we look to Jesus. So I walk through the life of Christ all throughout the book and say, look, here's a limit he had. We see him going off to pray, right? We see him choosing only 12 disciples. He heals some people, but not all people. He lives in one little like small backwoods part of Palestine. There are so many things. He chooses to sleep. He chooses to pray. He chooses to wait on God in the wilderness temptations instead of taking things for himself. There's so many different examples in the life of Christ that show us what a life of good limits looks like, and that we can actually find freedom within those limits. It's just so countercultural.
It is countercultural. And so as I was reading your book, I know, and you talk about this in the book, but
Mhm.
how can I know if I'm at a place where I need to start leaning into some limits? Like
Mhm.
what are some signals that might happen, say, in my mind, in my body, or
Mhm.
what are some things that might happen that are kind of
Mhm.
inviting me to do that?
Mhm. Well, I think it probably varies per person, but if you realize, oh gosh, I'm just like snapping at my family, or I'm like subtweeting, like
Mm,
excuse me, where I'm, bothered by someone else and I have to like display it on the internet, or even just finding yourself exhausted. There's so many people I know who think that something's really wrong with them, that they have some sort of disease. And then the doctor's like, there's nothing wrong with you. You just need to actually like sleep and rest. And it's stress that is manifesting itself in our bodies. And so I think there's different ways in which we can start to notice that once we have pushed past our limits, and maybe not even articulated what those are, that we will need to like take a step back and a reevaluation, and maybe even just study the life of Christ and go, what sort of limits did he have? We see him sleep, we see him pray. He spent 30 years in obscurity. There's so many lessons that we can take to heart from that.
yeah. You know, one of the things that when we talk about, you know, spiritual disciplines, spiritual
Yep.
rhythms in our lives, because I was thinking about this as I was reading your book,
Yeah.
uh, hardly anybody talks about limits or a spiritual rhythm and discipline.
Yeah.
And you've already said you saw this in the life of Jesus. What are some other places, or what are some other voices, maybe people that influence your way of thinking when it comes to this
Hmm.
idea of limits?
Hmm. There's so many great philosophers, and Charles Taylor talking about we don't live in a transcendent universe any longer. It's, the immanent frame is this idea that like there's a ceiling, right? That we have no connection to things like mystery or transcendence or even the divine. And so when we live in the world, which is really our world, it's hard to even think that limits are good. We can tend to then think that because there isn't anything higher, right? All I have is what I can gain, what I can get here. And so when we don't feel like those limits are going to actually get us anything, I think then we keep bypassing them, because that's really, it feels like our only way to happiness. I love David Brooks. He talks a lot in his most recent book, The Second Mountain, where he says, in this first mountain of life, he talks about as this, kind of the mountain of achievement. And that when we get there, though, we realize this isn't actually given to me all of these things that I said I want. It's not providing peace or contentment or happiness. And it's that second mountain where we are choosing to actually give up those sorts of achievement goals, into, trying to pour into other people. And it's really his own journey, right, has been into a life of faith, moving from kind of a secular humanist viewpoint. And he talks about this life without limits. He says particularly hard on young adults, because there's this idea that we have to continually curate and kind of create our own happiness. And that is just so much weight on any one individual, is to say, like, I have to pick this perfect major and get this perfect job and marry this perfect person. And if I get anything wrong, then my life will be a failure. And yet the life of Christ reminds us that our limits are actually, even if we have to walk through dark valleys, that they are things that can actually kind of provide a pathway through those dark valleys, rather than like trying to spend our whole lives pushing down those hardships or those darkness moments.
Yeah. What are some things that it might do to somebody, maybe just to our bodies, to our souls,
Yeah.
just do to us, if we just refuse to live in limits? My
Yeah.
kids do 5,000 different things a week, and
Right.
I am
Yeah.
always up, I'm
Right.
just going to refuse to do it. What might happen to us?
Yeah. Well, I think our bodies will revolt at some point, I think, for that pace. But I think what would also be really devastating is, let's say you're saying, okay, I'm gonna go all into my kids' happiness. And so they're
Mm,
gonna have every opportunity. And then invariably they will come back to you when they're 25 and tell you something you've done that has been horrible for, for them. And if we have spent our whole lives trying to whatever moving target of our children's happiness is, we will have nothing to help us in that moment of when a kid comes back and say, actually, I just wanted your attention and not 800 extracurricular activities. Because all we will have is defensiveness at that point, because we said, this is what I did so that you could have this perfect life and you don't appreciate it. So it's your fault. And so we are actually then ruining our relationship with our children, which was the whole point, probably, right? In trying to give them everything. And yet, if we have said, these are the limits and the guardrails, like, sorry, you're not going to play soccer on Sunday because it's a Sabbath to the Lord, and we're going to spend time as a family. And yeah, you might hate it, but that's also then through the years restoring our own soul, so that when the kid comes back and says, like, I hated that you didn't give me all of these things, you at least then say, I get that, but yet we are trying to train you in righteousness, and to show you that there is something that matters more than your personal happiness or your success or these routes to so-called freedom that the culture will continue to throw at you as this is what the good life is. So that might be one thing.
Yeah. I just would not want people to miss the example that you used, so when the culture would say, go all in on your culture, on your kids, rather, the kids' happiness, that is exactly what the culture tells us to do.
It does.
And so this is not a small tweak, is it? This is a revolutionary, it really is. You use the word invitation. I love that word. It really is a revolutionary invitation, though, to live in a new way. But do you think that maybe even some things in this season, I've heard so many people say, you know what, I found, this more time with my family has been good, and that sort of thing. Even though the culture fights against this, there is something in us that longs for it.
Yeah, for sure. There's been so many people have commented like that, the kind of machine of success and productivity, whether that's with our kids or our work, is going to try to get us back to normal, as quickly as possible. And I think it's just really wise to remember that as we've had this completely earth-shattering, upside down sort of sense of life in the last year and a half due to the pandemic, is that, you don't have to follow what your particular culture says is the good life. As Christians, we have to choose that what God says is the good life is the good life. And even if it doesn't look like it, that we are still being invited into it. And that's what trust looks like, I think.
Yeah. You already kind of referenced it a little bit earlier, but how much of the struggle that we might have with this stems from the definition that the culture gives us of what freedom is?
Oh, I think that's really the heart of the problem, is that we are living just amongst a generation and several generations where we have begun to think of freedom not as freedom from maybe even tyranny, for instance, but that we begin to think of freedom as my autonomous choice at any moment in time. And so any limits we experience, whether that's, we've committed to ourselves to a spouse, or, that we are parents, or, we are volunteering in our local churches, or even, the limits in our workplaces, we can feel them as constraints. And we tend to automatically think that anything that constrains us is therefore bad for us. And yet we all drive on freeways, right? And we see that there are guardrails and that there are lane lines. And if we had no sort of guardrails or lane lines, no constraints, there would be much more death and destruction and a lot more like bubbling anxiety, like, am I going to get killed on this road? And I think it's just wise to remember that constraints by themselves are not bad. It's what kind of constraints that we have that can lead us towards flourishing or not.
Yeah. I like the way that you put this in the book. I don't have it in front of me, but I was just really struck by the way that you put it, that limits are actually a path to freedom, that it's not, it's not, I'm going to give up all of these freedoms and I'm limiting myself, but they are the pathway to freedom. Could you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So many things all the writerly books and things that I read talk about the importance of creativity flourishes in limits. So whether it's something like, you need to sit down for 20 minutes and just free write, or, you need to have a word count or a date on the calendar that you're trying to get something done, that it's actually in those limits, that as you practice those limits, that creativity begins to actually show up in some ways. I had a friend she said in her art class in college that her art professor said they could only use 2 complementary colors the entire semester. They couldn't use any other colors. And you feel that limit and it feels restrictive. And yet it allowed her and those students to actually produce something a lot more creative that had they not had that limit, it wouldn't have allowed them to go through the limit, right? They would have just been frustrated and picked up another color. And yet it's as you walk through those limits that then you actually kind of grow into something more that you wouldn't have been able to have because of those limits.
Yeah. So you've been practicing limits, living into limits for a while. Is there one that you have found particularly challenging for you?
I think social media can be really hard.
Okay.
Because the social media, I think, gives us this allure that we're not limited in our bodies or our communities, that we can kind of be everywhere at once. And I think social media can provide community, but there's a sense in which often, we're only gravitating to those people who are like us, who vote the same as us, who look like us and have similar experiences towards us. So it doesn't actually help us necessarily to grow through difference. One thing I love about our local churches is that they are intended to be a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-socioeconomic community, that through that very difference, through those limits, that we're actually being formed into something altogether new. And so I think social media can sometimes be like the anti-church, where we only gather in like groups, and also it gives us this allure that we're not limited. We don't have to have the hard conversation with a neighbor or someone at church, or, even our own selves, because we can pick up a phone and get distracted. And so putting limits on my time on social media, I think, is really important too. And it's hard because, especially with my book's coming out, and so I want to share about it and talk to people about it. But at the other sense, I realize that this is something I've created, and I hope it's a message that's encouraging to folks. And yet nothing I do can really affect the outcome. It's a good reminder to put some limits on some of our consumption of media.
Yeah. And so you talked about social media. You talk about social media in the book. So I would love to dive in there. So for the person that's watching, they just have no guardrails, no limits at all on social media. Why would you advise them, hey, you might want to think about it?
Yeah. Well, I think, unfortunately, social media, right? How all the algorithms work, of course, is so that we are, it kind of forces polarization. And, if we as Christians are supposed to be a light to the world and salty salt, that's supposed to bring out the flavor of goodness, not just in the church, but in the wider world and in various cultures, we have to realize that social media is forming us. And I would just even say, okay, delete social media off your phone for the weekend. Just start there, because then you can't get it unless you're sitting down at a computer. And that takes at least a level of kind of thoughtfulness of, why am I getting on there? But that might be just an easy first place to start. Delete it off your phone every weekend. That's another kind of practice I have for Sabbath keeping as well, is I'm not going to be on social media. I'm trying to not be on screens unless we're we're watching a movie or something as a family, because I know too much of that is going to make me angry and frustrated, or make me feel envious or depressed, or, any other sort of feeling that we can get when we just unconsciously scroll. So I would just start there. But then also, you can also look, if you have an iPhone, they have their weekly screen time. And you can go, oh my gosh, I've been on this many hours a day. Maybe that's not good. And you could change. You can also even just make your phone work for you and change your settings and say, this is the time limit per app, is another great thing. Yeah. So then at least you realize the extent to which you are going back to social media for comfort.
Hmm. I love the language that you put, how social media forms us. And and maybe the way to answer this would be, what does it do for you? But so if I begin to limit the way that I interact and get on social media, if I do a lot of what you just now said, what begins to get formed in me? And again, you might want to answer that for yourself as you limit yourself, say on, no social media on Sabbath or these other things. How does God use that in your life? What do you find is being formed in you as you're away from social media?
Well, I think, yesterday it was Labor Day when we're recording this, and my family and I it turned out to be a much longer hike than we anticipated, because the parking lot was like 3 miles from the trailhead. And so I think it was about 11 miles of hiking, and which was excessive for all of us because we're not avid hikers. And yet I realized, like, the only reason I had my phone was to count our miles and I snapped a few photos during the day. And it made me, help my child, right? Instead of distracting myself from maybe her pain and frustration, it was like, okay, we got to actually be present. We got to work through this. And often I can use social media, when I'm bored or I'm waiting in the line, or, my children are erupting and it feels like a safe place to go to. And so to choose to kind of put it away, we were able to kind of work through the pain. It was mile 8, my 7-year-old daughter, and she's like, I can't do this anymore. And I was like, I know. But it was like, I tried to say, okay, every time you complain, let's try to think of something beautiful you see, to kind of counteract it. That didn't seem to work. Eventually, another mile or so into it, she realizes she can say, I'm tired, but, I'm tired, but I'm having fun. I'm tired, but I'm going to make it. And it was such a great reminder that we hold together our pain, our sorrows, and our joys at the same time. And it was really only because we had a lot of time, and we had a lot of time to work through that, that we were able to really come to something that was beautiful. That was a lesson for me, because about mile 10, I was ready to be done too. And we still another mile and a half to go. So, I think there is a patient unfolding of our lives with God, and we often will pick up social media and we bypass that slower transformative work that God wants to do in us.
Would that just be true with limits in general, that we want, growth, sanctification? We want everything God has for us. We just want everything now.
Right.
But limits are, this is slow. I'm building the space here. Would that be true for limits in general, that this is a way that God will use this in your life?
I think so, because I think, what's so beautiful about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is he's asking his disciples to watch him pray. They're falling asleep. He's so alone in that moment. And yet eventually, through a lot of agony and prayer, he actually submits his own will to God the Father. And I think since the garden, we haven't really wanted ever to submit our own wills to God, and our limits force us to at least get to that place, to those wrestling places like Jesus was, not, because this is for the salvation of the world, mind you, but, that we will wrestle with God through our limit. And it's only as we go through those valleys that we will actually be changed and transformed. We just want, like, the pixie dust, I think, a little bit of like this upwardly mobile Western life. But unfortunately, it seems to be, it's only through, that real change and transformation happens. So yeah, I think that might be, that's a good way to think about most of our limits. Will allow us that longer space of transformation if we let them and we don't run away from them.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about busy habits. And so what are some examples of what a busy habit might be?
I think a lot of that, it can be things like choosing to say yes to everything, so that we're just like driving around a lot. It can be that we don't find the ability to like sit still might be like, oh, I'm probably
Mm.
having some sort of busy habit going on here where, they're always like, I find this sometimes, right, when I'm trying to sit down and it's a writing day and it's like, oh, well, suddenly I need to do the laundry and
Oh,
the
yeah.
kitchen needs scrubbing. And we tend to run away from the pain of just like sitting and being still and maybe failing. And I think some of those busy habits, some of them look outward, like we're running around town to 100 different activities, and some of them look inward, is that we are distracting ourselves from silence or solitude or prayer, that we realize that we're trying to be productive to earn our worth.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned earlier is that churches can actually stop people from living in their limits. And so I would
Mhm.
love for you to talk about, and maybe even church is a busy habit. Churches can
Yeah.
help people. If you don't have a busy habit,
Yeah.
church might give you one, And so
Right. Right.
what are some ways that churches might actually go against or, unintentionally go
Right.
against this?
I think it's really hard because in most churches, it's about 20% of the people who end up volunteering for most things, and
Yeah.
80% just kind of show up. Um, and I don't want to say, as I was talking about the book with my community, a lot of people were saying, I've said yes to too many things. But the things that they might be saying no to might be things that are actually good for them. Like,
Mm.
I can't volunteer for Sunday school. I can't, do setup because, it's not fulfilling to me personally, in this moment in time. And I have done that too. And, so I do want to just be careful in saying, churches need help. And sometimes the limits, that you're being invited into are not, they are actually for the good of other people. And they're not necessarily for you to have like this perfectly chill calendar. And they're not necessarily for you to always be like in your wheelhouse of comfort or
Mhm.
like, I'm really the best at this. So I don't want to say that, but I will say that churches can tend to often prioritize the task over the person, especially, especially when there's lots of tasks to be done and they need a lot of help. And so I think really as church leaders, as we're asking for volunteers, for setup or tear down or the children's ministry, is to really be saying, how am I communicating that message? How am I empowering those volunteers so that their own volunteering work is out of a place of deep spiritual being with Jesus instead of just simply doing for Jesus? And so I think there's a way to both say, yeah, we do need you, to teach Sunday school, you know, several times. Our church plant that we're a part of now, they're talking about, okay, you're going to have a certain time on and then a certain time off. And so
Mm.
and then we're also going to make sure that you as a spouse are not serving, so that you and your spouse can like sit in church together. And so I think these are important sort of guardrails that even churches can do to say, yes, we need you to extend yourself for the good of the body, because that's how we're being formed into the bride of Christ. But also we realize you're tired, you're exhausted, and we're not going to work you and keep you just busy. That we believe that whatever volunteer role that you're doing, that you're actually being formed into the likeness of Christ. And we're going to help support that, by, feeding you dinner,
Mm.
once a month, or having a round table where you're able to just express your tiredness or your confusion, so that we're loving the person instead of simply inviting them into more busy tasks.
Yeah. And so you just now mentioned that you are a part of a church plant. Is the
Mhm.
church plant you're a part of, are they trying to intentionally build this into not just the way that they operate, but even into the people that are there in the church plant?
Yeah,
What's that look like?
that's kind of how my husband got hired. I think is, the church planter who planted about 5 or 6 years ago, just, there's so much only one person, right, can do. And
Mm.
so my husband, with a background in church planting and having done that, deeply understood that challenge. And so his job really is to help towards like spiritual formation for the entire church, rather than just here's, coordinating all of the tasks. And so how do we pour into the leaders? How do we pour into the Sunday school teachers is really what we are, trying to do, so that it isn't simply, we only want you if you can give something to us.
Yeah.
Which it can just feel like.
Oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I've said, even if that's not what it's intended from the leadership, in any sort of system, it can feel like that if you're not consciously able to spend time with people, meeting them where they're at. Yeah.
Ashley, there are several people who watch and listen. A good portion of the audience, they are leaders in churches, of different sizes, or just leaders in general, people with influence. And obviously the temptation of leaders is to burn the candle at both ends. Let's not stop. Like you said, if it's going to happen, it's up to me. What's a word that you might have for leaders about why this is something especially that important for them? They need to pay attention to this.
Well, eventually you will burn out and you will be betrayed and you will not be appreciated. And if your foundation in any way is really resting on your productivity or results or things you can measure, when those things happen, it will drive you to push people away, to feel like a victim, and you will not be loving Jesus or loving your neighbor. And ultimately, I think those of us who get into church ministry, we are so compelled by Jesus's message to love God and love our neighbor. And yet we find ourselves feeling like the people we are serving are really kind of out to get us, or they're just being lazy or whatever. We won't be actually drawn into Jesus's suffering and find that he is enough if we are burning the candle at both ends. Because eventually, because God cares for us and loves us, he will bring us to those places. And eventually those places can either draw us deeper into intimacy with God and a sense that, I'm doing this work and yet it doesn't define me. And so there's a lightness there and ability to love others, or it will cause you to be bitter and resentful and you will not be showing the fruits of the Spirit. But I think, as we do these small little things, like, we put limits around how much work we're doing and sleep, and we are choosing to go off and pray and be in silence and solitude like Jesus was, as we pay attention to one person at a time, and be in our actual bodies in our actual neighborhoods. I think we'll begin to kind of get breadcrumbs towards that spacious life, so that when those dark valleys come, we are drawn deeper into intimacy with Jesus. So we can say, like Paul, like, I've learned the secret of being content, that even if someone is betraying me or slandering me, that Jesus is enough. And I think that's really what we want.
Yeah. Just listening to you talk, so many of the stories that come out about ministry leaders who have fallen, and churches that, have, one time national platform fell. Somewhere in that story is a leader without a limit.
Yeah. 100%.
Right. Would you agree with that? What are your thoughts on that? This issue alone that you're talking about,
right,
could literally have prevented so many of the horror stories that we see.
Yeah. And that's so sad. It's just, it's so disheartening to, that they're, to some extent, that they're, the way success was really thought about in worldly standards. So that because this is just such an American thing, that we believe that God is good to the extent that my circumstances are good. Oh, wow. And what does it look like when our circumstances are bad? Do we think that God hates us? And so we have so imbibed that in the church, that what must be good is, unlimited growth, or, there's so many different ways in which that looks. But Jesus's life, right, looked like a long journey towards the cross. We don't think of our work in the church or the world as participating in the work that God's already doing, and being able to pull back, accept the limits of our moment, and wait for God to act. Instead, we like, yes, let's forge away. And I think you're exactly right. So many fallen leaders are because they didn't understand their limits, or didn't see them as good, for sure.
Yeah. And so, Ashley, just one more question. And I know that even in that vein, with thinking about church leaders, but not just church leaders, just anybody that is watching this, anybody that's listening to this, and they hear what you're saying, and they know that they've got to start doing this.
Yeah.
But they do not know where to start. What would you say to that person?
One thing I would do is, one thing I like encouraging people to do is to keep both like a delight list on one hand, and maybe like a limit list on the other hand. Because I think often we tend to think of our limits as just constraining and restrictive, and that they don't actually lead to flourishing. So even like making a list between those two and say, okay, yes, here are the limits of my body. Here's the limits of my time in this season. Here are my financial limits. And then to also say, either that delight list is something to return to, and when you're practicing rest, you can say, okay, pick something from the delight list. But it also helps you to see, okay, maybe some of my financial limits, I'm just feeling like, oh gosh, we just need more money so my kid can play club soccer. We're realizing that some of the delight list might be spending time playing board games, which is basically free. And so I think it helps us just kind of reevaluate sometimes of our limits as good. So that would be one just little quick way to start. I also have on my website a list of I call them pocket practices. And they're like these little, I actually have them here, like 3x5 cards that are available for folks.
Hey, Ashley, this has been so good. Tell us some ways that people can connect with you online.
So the easiest way to get in touch is if you go to my website at spacious.life. There's a few things you can do there. You can take a hustle habit quiz, which is really fun. And you can get a roadmap to kind of whatever your hustle habit is, with some good questions and some practical steps forward. You can pre-order the book there, and then you can also get those pocket practices. So that's spacious.life.